Chapter 6, Part 2. The light disappeared. He waited a moment, and it came again, and suddenly seemed to flare up, and was gone. What was it? Who was there? One thing was for certain. Harry needed to get out of the moonlight, back to the shadows, where he could not be seen. Or was it old Goggly, waiting in that leafy darkness behind the tower? At least Tangle seemed unalarmed. Feeling very exposed, Harry flitted back across the gravel, and vanished into the shadows beneath the gable wall. For a moment he stood panting, then stopped breathing to listen intently. Little rustles and whispery noises came from all over the garden. An owl screeched, and his head jerked round. From the patch of woodland came a low, moaning sound. "There's no such thing as ghosts," Harry told himself. Then again came that faint ripple and flare of light, like hidden lightning beyond the trees. Harry shivered. He should have done what everyone else told him, he thought, and stayed in bed. But now he had seen the light and heard the moaning, he wanted to know more. Keeping to the moon shadow as far as possible, he circled the lawns and came to the wood behind the tower. Their feet, boy and dog, left tracks in the cold dew. Harry's gym shoes were saturated. He hardly felt it. It would be difficult to lead Tangle through the trees. He untied the string. "Now be a good boy," he whispered earnestly. "Stay by me, you hear? No wandering off, and no barking." Cautiously Harry advanced. Twigs brushed his face. Icy cascades of dew fell on his head and shoulders. His ankle struck a fallen branch. Picking up a bleached fragment of the length of his arm, he continued. Dead twigs snapped beneath his feet. Frightened birds flew off through the branches, calling loudly. Tangle spotted a rabbit and shot off in pursuit, crashing through the undergrowth like a team of runaway horses. Harry froze, but the disturbance had not distracted whatever was lurking a short way off through the trees. The unearthly moaning was louder now. He heard tramping. The flicker and flare of light was brighter. At length he came to a small opening in the trees and halted. The night breeze had freshened. Overhead dark branches swayed and rustled against the moon. A minute passed, and in another minute his stomach rumbled loudly. He grimaced and sucked it in behind his belt. Still he waited, motionless, as the tree trunks which surrounded him. Suddenly, at the far side of the clearing, there was a tiny snap like the breaking of a twig. Harry's head jerked towards it. "Oh!" There was a low moan. A ghostly ripple of light floated just above him above the ground. It began to spread. Giant feet rose from the woodland floor. "What is it?" Harry was terrified. "Oh!" The cry was louder, longer, all about him. In the same instant the light flared up into the trees, 4 metres from the ground, and he was staring at a hideous, ghostly apparition. From the waist down it had long robes like a monk, but the head and torso were those of a beast with shining eyes, terrible fangs, and claws outstretched as if to rush across the small clearing and seize him. The creature moved, bellowed strangely, and was gone. Though the nightmare was visible for no more than a second, it was enough for Harry. Uttering shouts of terror, he fled. Branches and thorns scratched his face as he fought through trees and thickets. Something caught him round the ankle, and he fell full length. Desperately he tugged his foot free and ran on. At his back there were sounds of pursuit, heavy footsteps and something crashing through the undergrowth, while all the time the cries of old Goggly ran after him from the wood. "Oh!" The tower gave him protection. Harry sat at the foot of the spiral staircase and licked blood from a scratch on the back of his hand. His cheek was scratched too, and his legs. Both ankles were stinging. He did not mind. They would soon heal. The panic had passed, and he was thoughtful. At his feet, Tangle, who had joined him in the wild dash from the wood, was also licking himself. Their wet footmarks covered the entrance. Harry had bolted the studded door securely against the night and switched on the staircase lights. There was something fishy about old Goggly, he told himself. Something very fishy. Several things, in fact. For a start, despite all the people who had warned him, which was suspicious in itself, there was no such thing as ghosts. No matter what he had felt, no matter how he had fled screaming, they simply did not exist. Then the light had appeared so regularly, once every 3 minutes or so, and it was always accompanied by the moaning. He had never heard the moaning without the light, or seen the light without the moaning. Then there had been that little snap just before it started. It could have been the click of a switch. And to support that, The first time he fell, his ankle had been tangled in plastic cable, not brambles or thorny briar. He had felt it with his fingers as he tugged it off, smooth and slippery. Finally, what harm had old Gogley actually done him? None. All the terrible ghost had done was to appear and groan and billow strangely. Tiny beads of blood welled up again. He licked them off and reached down to pat Tangle. He had not been frightened, and dogs were supposed to be sensitive to anything supernatural. Harry decided to investigate. Quickly, he ran up the 47 steps and collected the old clock from beside his bed table. He ran back down, tugged open the bolts of the ancient door, switched off the lights, and a moment later, boy and dog were back in the moonlit garden. Harry needed one hand free and left his club against the wall by the tower door. If the worst came to the worst, the two-belled alarm clock could have been a formidable weapon. He balanced it in his hand. That was heavy enough to give anyone, ghost or man, a nasty headache. The wind blew in his face and whispered about the tower. Quickly he ran to the edge of the wood and vanished into shadows. Softly Harry advanced through the trees and stopped. He advanced again. Suddenly he saw the first low flickering light and heard the ghostly groan. He waited a moment later and saw the flare. There was a sound of crashing footsteps and the groaning ceased. He consulted the luminous clock in his hand. 14.5 minutes past 11. Briefly he searched for a comfortable patch and sat down with his back to a tree. "Come here, Tangle." One arm around his shaggy companion, he watched the minute hand creep round the face of the clock. The low light came again, and he heard moans, and the light flared and faded. Harry consulted his clock. 18.5 minutes past 11. He waited. It was very eerie. Anything madmen and tigers could have been lurking in the rustling black shadows which surrounded him. The light flared again. 22.5 minutes past 11. Precisely 4 minutes intervals. Harry rose. It was easy to get lost in the moonlit wood. For a while he floundered about, uncertain of the way. The light guided him from an unexpected direction, and at length he found himself back at the edge of the clearing. No sooner had he arrived than the faint snap made Tangle prick up his ears. Immediately the first lines of light shimmered above the woodland floor. A blood-chilling moan rose through the trees. The light grew and flared up, revealing the nightmare figure of old Gogley. The moans grew louder with a noise like heartbeats and the smashing of branches. It ceased. The performance was over. Harry advanced through the dew-laden ferns. His jeans were soaked, his jersey wet to the chest. Before him, where the apparition had manifested itself, a black rectangle was silhouetted against the trees. He stepped forward to examine it. Ow! His shin struck something sharp. It sounded hollow. He kicked it. It was a box. Harry bent to investigate. Exploring hands felt wood and cloth and wires. It was an old loudspeaker. He straightened and continued to the black shape. It was material, black canvas, tied with ropes between tree trunks and bellying like a sail in the breeze. The moonlight revealed faint lines. He traced them with his fingertips. It was the outline of old Gogley. Harry was still standing there when at his feet came the snap of a switch. At once the bottom lines of the drawing were illuminated. He leaned forward to examine them. It appeared to be some kind of conducive, luminous paint. The loudspeaker began its moaning, so loud and eerie close at hand that Tangle threw back his head and began to howl in union. "Ow! You! Ow! You! Oh, shut up, Tangle!" Harry said. As he spoke, the whole canvas was illuminated. High overhead, the monk's robes merged into a shaggy breast. The terrible eyes stared. Claws and fangs seemed ready to tear an intruder to shreds. Although it was only a luminous cartoon, a kind of haunting, in that place at the dead of night, accompanied by the groans and crashing footsteps, it was terrifying. The light was extinguished, the loudspeaker fell silent, and Harry retreated into the trees. "Well, Tangle," he crouched and took a wet forepaw. "What a trick that was! What a lot of trouble somebody went to! The question is, why?" He glanced over his shoulder just in case. "Why do you think they want me to stay in the tower? What are they trying to hide? Do you know?" Tangle did not reply. Harry rubbed the rough head and rose. "Well, I don't either, so let's go and find out." The wet jeans clung to his legs. He pulled them straight and wriggled icy toes. The discomfort did not bother him at all. "Isn't this great?" He looked up at the moon. "Out in the wood at nearly midnight. A real adventure."